Welcome back, everybody. We're here for episode 2 of my 3-part series on the history of the P-51. So if you haven't seen episode 1, please head down into the comments and jump back and watch episode 1. So episode 1 covers the development of the P-51 up into the first production model. This episode, episode 2, we're going to cover the early Allison engine models and then leading into the Merlin engined BC and the D models. And now episode 3, I'm going to cover the post P-51D model. So some of the one-off prototypes that happened along with the H model, and then moving into the post-war development of the P-51 Mustang. So if, as I said, if you haven't seen episode 1, head down to the description, go back and watch episode 1, then come back and watch this episode 2. If you're watching this episode just after I launch this video, episode 3 will be releasing next month. If this is after a month of being releasing this, again, down in the descriptions, I will have a link to episode 3 when it gets released. So you'll be able to see every video using the links below once I have them all uploaded. So before we get started, if you have seen episode 1, this intro is going to sound familiar. I'm going to basically rehash the first episode's intro again. So basically, I'm doing these videos to help clear the waters on some of the history of the P-51. Considering it's a very popular aircraft, most people know P-51 off sight. They know the name. Most people consider it the best fighter of World War II. Very few people know the actual history behind the P-51 and kind of why it came about and where it ended up being what it was. And considering, again, how famous it is, the amount of misinformation I've seen out there, being online on the different forums and seeing just how even people who know a lot about aviation don't understand the intricacies of the P-51 history. For example, the differences between a B and a C model, or what changes were made to make the D model. And it was such a varied aircraft, so many different models. There's a lot of confusion out there. So hopefully you guys will end up walking away from this video learning something and getting a little bit more information out on the P-51. So again, thank you for watching. If you haven't seen episode 1, please go back and watch episode 1. And on that note, enjoy. Here we go. History of the P-51. And as always, my name is Sean, and this is Sean's Aviation. And just before we get into the video, something I should have been doing a lot more up till now, and that is just asking you guys out there, if you enjoy what you're looking at, if you like what I'm doing, go down below, click on the like page, subscribe to my channel, and by all means, please click on that little notification bell. If that way you guys get alerted when I do get more new content up. I usually try to do the What's on My Desk monthly update beginning of the month. And I usually try to get a video or a series of videos released by the 15th, the middle of the month. So whether that's going to be a tips and tricks video, or an aviation history video, or my time-lapse videos of the previous model builds that I've got done, or an air show video, or some of my new product review videos I'll be doing. So I'm going to try to get something posted by the middle of the month. So please, if you're enjoying this, subscribe, like, and click that notification bell. Let's move on to the video. So now, if you've watched the first half, you've seen the history of the development of P-51, why it came about, how we got to the aircraft being in service, not only with the RAF, but with the United States Army Air Forces. So now we're going to take a small step back, but we're going to go into a lot more detail. And what we're going to do is we're going to go through every major variant, and then some not so major, but basically every variant of the P-51 Mustang, and go through its distinguishing features, how to tell it apart from other versions, and really get to the heart of what each different version was. This is where a lot of confusion comes from. There was a lot of different versions of the P-51, especially in the early Allison engine, and a lot of people just assume that there's just one version. It's just, oh, that's an Allison Mustang and those are the later Mustangs, and it wasn't. It's a very complicated, in-depth history. So we're going to take the time, we're going to look into these detailed histories, and you guys out there will actually get to understand really what went into making the P-51 what it was today. So we're going to start this stuff off talking about the NA73. I know the NA73 was the one-off prototype. I did talk about it a little bit in the first episode, so I'm not going to go into too much detail about it right now, but I will take this time to talk about the NA numbers. You're going to hear me talking about these quite a bit in this video. For example, as I just said, this prototype was called the NA73. Now, it's actually a pretty easy system to figure out. It's just North American's internal designator for that aircraft, and many companies use a very similar way of keeping track of their internal designs. So the NA73 was simply the 73rd design for North American Aviation, and that number would actually change every time an aircraft gets redeveloped or redesignated. So you're going to see a lot of these numbers that get skipped, and it might seem completely nonsensical, but in reality every number is sequential and just certain numbers never got built, whereas other ones did. So a good example for this is the T6 Harvard. So a T6C is classified as an NA88, whereas a T6G is classified as an NA168. Now with the B-25 Mitchell, another North American Aviation design, the B-25C model was classified as an NA87. Sorry, that's a D model. The B-25D is classified as an NA87, where the B-25J was classified as an NA108. So as I go through these and you hear the different versions, I am going to be using the NA numbers, and you're going to see how everything sequentially lines up as the aircraft evolves, and you can see how many other aircraft got developed in between these different versions. So it's not very difficult. That is what the NA numbers stand for. And to go back to the NA73, this is actually where a lot of the confusion with the Mustang actually begins. And it's simply because the NA73, as I said, was the one and only prototype. And if you'd watched my initial video, you would have seen that it did crash. It did fly a little bit later on, but it was basically retired, and I'm not even too sure what happened with the NA73. I'll have to look into the history of where that happened to that airframe. So the NA73 was the prototype. Now, it never received an American designation, and it never really received a British designation. I mean, I guess you could call it the Mustang because the British named the aircraft the Mustang, but it never received an actual U.S. Army Air Corps pursuit number. The first aircraft to receive that would be the Mustang I, the production version, the Mustang I, and it was named, two of them, as I said, were named XP-51s and were used by the U.S. Army Air Corps. But they were not prototypes. The two XP-51s are actually full production aircraft, and they're numbers 4 and 10 off the production line. So they're not anywhere near prototypes. They were classified as XP-51 simply because the U.S. Air Force didn't have them in service, so that's what they named them. They were an XP, they were an experimental aircraft for the U.S., or prototype aircraft for the U.S. Army Air Corps or U.S. Army Air Forces, even though the aircraft were fully production aircraft. And even to this day, the EAA Museum, if you look at their database of their information, their website, the placards in the museum, they announce it as the prototype, one of the prototype P-51s. It isn't. It is the fourth, the one that the EAA Museum has is the fourth production aircraft. Technically, the fifth one built, because you have the first prototype was built, the NA73, and then you had 1, 2, 3 full production P-51s that were, at the time, they were classified as Mustang I's that were delivered to the RAF. And this here, number 4, or the fifth built, became the XP-51. So right off the bat, people look at that and say, oh, it's a prototype, it's the prototype. It isn't. That's not the prototype. It is one of the XP-51s that the U.S. Army took. Now, don't get me wrong, it's amazing that the EAA Museum has the fourth production model P-51. I mean, you're never going to get much older than that. So it's an amazing item for what it is and a piece of history, but it is not a prototype, never was a prototype. It is strictly the fourth production model. So some of the identifying features of the NA73 when you're looking at pictures are
Short carburetor intake. As I said, the NA73 for the most part only flew with a short carburetor intake before its crash, and only a small number of the Mustang Is were built with a short carb intake before being converted to the long intake design. Now, if you're looking at a picture of a Mustang and it is painted in a silver paint scheme, an American looking paint scheme, but has a short carburetor intake, chances are you're looking at the NA73. As well, there was no armament fitted to an NA73. So the key part is look underneath the engine cowlings, and if there are machine guns, that would have been a Mustang or a P-51, whereas if it has no guns under the cowling and a short carb intake, you're definitely looking at the NA73. It also had the small radiator intake, a larger radiator exhaust door. This will make a little bit more sense as we go farther down, but just understand, small intake, large radiator exhaust door, and it has a non-armored forward windscreen. So the first flight of the NA73 was on October 26th of 1940, and the last flight was on July 15th of 1941. Depressingly, the final outcome of the NA73 is unknown. Many company personnel remember that when the aircraft was retired from test flighting duties, it was just pushed to the side of the factory, and eventually it just disappeared, whether it got scrapped or donated to a local school or what. Nobody really knows what happened to it, and it's quite a shame considering what the P-51 eventually became.
So next up, we're going to look at the Mustang I. Now, as I said, the Mustang I was only flown by the RAF other than those two airframes that were delivered to Wright Field and classified as XP-51s. So the first few that the RAF bought, the first few Mustang Is that came off the production run, had the shorter carb intake over the top of the cowling. Now, once they finished the investigation on the prototype crash, the NA73 crash, they came to the conclusion that they needed to extend that. Those were then modified, and as far as I know, none of them were delivered to the RAF overseas with a short carb intake. That was all corrected at the factory before they were officially delivered. However, you can find a few of them out there, pictures of them early in the production run, where they have the short carb intake. So these also had British radios, and they had armor plate installed.
So with the Mustang I, the radiator intake was also modified and was slightly enlarged to help with some cooling issues. In this picture, you can also clearly see the variation between the open and closed radiator intake and exhaust doors. So it had an Allison V1710-39, developing 1,120 horsepower at 3,000 RPM. Armament included two 50s and four 303s in the wings, and two 50s in the nose under the engines. Here you can clearly see the undernose armament. The wing guns were mounted on a slight outboard angle to facilitate the running of the ammo chutes due to the thin wing design. You can see the outboard angle of the guns in this picture here. It entered service in April of 1941 with 2 Squadron, and it first went into action on May 10th, 1941, attacking an airfield just across the Channel in France. At this time, there were very few Mustangs in Europe, and many squadrons were assigned only 1 or 2 and usually flew mixed squadrons, usually alongside Lysender's and P-40s. On July 27th, 2 Squadron did something never done before. Mustangs took off from England and flew all the way into Germany, attacking targets in the Ruhr, the first time an Allied fighter aircraft had done so. On the 19th of August, the Mustang made its first kill. An FW-190 attacking troops in the Dieppe landing, shot down by pilot officer Hollis Hills. Shot down by pilot officer Hollis Hills, an American pilot flying with 414 RCAF Squadron. This was also, sadly, the first day a Mustang was shot down. Cameras were able to be installed when needed, with one behind the radiator facing downward, and one behind the pilot facing down and rearward through a bulged rear window. So here you can see a standard canopy, and here you can see one with cameras installed. There were no provisions for underwing stores on these early Mustangs. However, that would change in the future, and 620 were built in total. So some identifying features of the Mustang I. It has a long carburetor intake, includes 6 guns in the wings and 2 guns in the nose. It has a larger radiator intake than the NA73, and it has the armored forward windscreen. So the first flight of the Mustang I took place April 23rd of 1941, and the RAF, surprisingly, still had them in service as late as 1945. So for the third aircraft that we're going to be talking about, it's going to be the Mustang IA, which is the first, even though it's technically the third iteration of the Mustang, and the second full batch of production aircraft. It is the first aircraft to officially get the U.S. Army Air Force designation of P-51. And as I said, the RAF called it the Mustang IA. And there were 150, which were initially purchased by the U.S. Army Air Corps through the Lend-Lease program. And as I said, the Lend-Lease program required that the aircraft be purchased by the U.S. and then lent to the Allies to be used during the war, not sold, but lent to them. So the U.S. paid for them and then they were lent. So they were purchased as P-51s, and then the 150 was supposed to be lent to the RAF, but through some wrangling, the U.S. Army Air Corps took over, or the U.S. Army Air Forces took over part of that production run and used them as P-51s. Now, as I said, the U.S. Army Air Force had to purchase these aircraft and give them an internal designation and then move them to the final user. And the designation that was picked was the P-51 Apache. Now, it was very similar to the Mustang I, although the RAF had made some radio and armament changes after the lessons learned during the Battle of Britain. These were very minor. Due to the lack of the hitting power of the 303s against German aircraft, it was decided to delete the nose guns, and the 6 wing guns were swapped out for 4 20mm Hispano-Suiza cannons, the same type of cannons that were used in the Spitfire at the time. So this version retained the ability to have the cameras installed when needed, and the Allison V1710-39 was also retained from the previous model. Although the U.S. Army Air Force still could not see a use for this aircraft, with the P-38, P-39, P-40, and P-47 all either entering service or in production, 57 of the 150 P-51s built for the RAF were retained for United States Army Air Force services. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, there was a desperate need for new aircraft, and these were a convenient batch to acquire since they were already paid for and built. 55 of these had the cameras installed and were sent to reconnaissance units, while 2 were set aside for further engine tests. Although the U.S. Army Air Force officially designated these first aircraft the F-6A Apache. F-6 was the U.S. designation for all reconnaissance versions of the P-51A. Most people still referred to it as a P-51 Mustang, and the Apache name was quietly dropped and Mustang officially adopted by the U.S. Army Air Force. The majority of the aircraft were assigned to the Mediterranean theater, and the first U.S. Army Air Force P-51 combat mission took place on April 9, 1943, when one flew a reconnaissance mission in Tunisia. The first U.S. Air Force loss was on April 23, 1943, when one was shot down by friendly ground fire, the P-51 being routinely misidentified as an ME-109, especially in the early years of its service in the European theater. Many of the United States Army Air Force aircraft eventually had the cameras removed, and the bulge windows were replaced by a normal flat one. Most of these early P-51s were still in service well after D-Day in secondary roles. The first Mustang Ace was crowned by the RAF on June 11, 1943, when the now flight lieutenant, Hollis Hills, the same pilot who got the first P-51 kill, shot down his 5th enemy fighter while flying a Mustang IA. So some of the identifying features of the P-51/Mustang IA are the long carburetor intake, the lack of nose guns, the wing-mounted 20mm cannons, and the occasional fit of the oblique cameras. Deliveries started in July of 1942, and the type was still in service well into 1945. So next up we have sort of the black sheep of the P-51 family, and again, it's an aircraft that causes a lot of confusion in the history of the P-51 because not a lot of people know sort of this back Allison engine detailed history, and this A-36 Apache, which we're going to talk about, really kind of muddies the water a little bit. But basically, the U.S. Army Air Corps, after getting the initial P-51s, the P-51, which the British called the Mustang I, and had that 20mm cannon armament, which the U.S. Army Air Corps initially called the Apache, they realized that the aircraft had potential. And the U.S. Army Air Corps, U.S. Army Air Forces, however you want to call it at this point, wanted more. And they wanted more now. But unfortunately, there was no more room in the budget to purchase a fighter aircraft. You're looking at things like the P-40, the P-38, the P-39. You've got the P-47 coming online at this point. So you have all of these purchases being made for fighter aircraft. They couldn't find room in the budget to buy another fighter aircraft, or a pursuit aircraft, as they would call it at the time, hence the P designation. But they had room for an attack aircraft. So they went back to North American and quickly asked, can you convert and turn this into an attack aircraft? Because if you can, we'll buy some. So North American Aviation, along with Colonel Eccles of the United States Army Air Force, decided to go ahead and look into producing an attack version of the P-51. So due to the high speeds of the P-51, it was decided to install dive brakes, which you can see pictures of here, in order to reduce the dive speed while bombing. These pop-up brakes were installed both above and below the wings, more or less on the center of the wing. It was also decided to revert back to an all-machine gun armament with 250s in the nose and 450s in the wing. A bomb shackle was installed under each wing, but it was slightly inboard of the location on later models, which we'll get to in a little bit. This was to reduce the stress on the airframe when the aircraft entered into the dive, and in the off chance the aircraft had to recover from a dive with bombs still attached. Other minor changes, including the moving of the landing light and the pitot tube due to the installation of the dive brakes. The Allison V1710-87 was installed on this model, producing 1,325 horsepower at 3,000 feet, but the power dropped off significantly above 12,000 feet, a slightly lower altitude than the previous model. One final modification was to remove the inlet door on the radiator intake and leave it as a fixed size. So North American Aviation used the name Apache during the development of this process, as that was the official name given to the P-51 by the United States Army Air Force while the A-36 was being designed. By the time the aircraft entered service with the United States Army Air Forces, however, the P-51 was renamed Mustang, and the name Invader was officially given to the A-36 by the United States Army Air Forces. For whatever reason, this name never caught on, and most people continued to call the A-36 the Apache. The first aircraft rolled off the production line in September of 1942 and entered service with the United States Army Air Forces that October, deploying overseas to North Africa in the spring of 1943. A-36s were used extensively in the China-Burma campaign, but little elsewhere. Very early in the operational use of the A-36, a serious defect was found. This was not uncommon in World War II aircraft, as new designs were put into production and combat without a thorough testing period. Due to an issue with unequal opening of the dive brakes, causing spins, stalls, and loss of control, the dive angle was restricted to 70 degrees instead of the usual 90 degrees of most other dive bombers. Most units actually wired the dive brakes shut in order to mitigate their use, although some units still use them to get maximum bombing accuracy. Although the aircraft was little known and only 500 were built, those who flew them regarded them as an outstanding fighter aircraft due to its speed, range, and maneuverability. Many of the A-36s in combat had yellow identification stripes painted in the wings in order to reduce the number of friendly fire incidences. So some of the identifying features of the A-36 are the long carburetor intake, nose guns, while only having 4 wing guns. All other versions with nose guns would have had 6 machine guns in the wing. The dive brakes, so even if the dive brakes were wired shut, you would still see the dive brakes on the top and the bottom of the wing. The underwing hard points, and a fixed radiator inlet. Almost half of all A-36s built were lost in combat, most to flak and ground fire, making the few A-36s still left in the world extremely rare and a really, really cool aircraft to look at if you ever get a chance to see one. It's a very neat plane to see for anybody who has any type of interest in the P-51 Mustang.
So the next aircraft in line is the P-51A, or as the RAF called it, the Mustang II. Now this design had actually begun before the A-36, but was shelved once work on the A-36 began, and then it was brought forward again once there was some more money found to continue the design. Now this was an update of the airframe to incorporate lessons learned in combat in Europe and bring it up to what a modern fighter would be considered at the time.
So on June 23rd of 1942, which was into the next fiscal year, when more money became available for the purchase of fighters, the United States Army Air Force placed an order for 1,200 P-51As. Although this was reduced in number in December to 310, with 50 of those being diverted to the RAF to replace the 57 Mustang Ias that the U.S. Army Air Force acquired from its order. So this aircraft used the Allison V1710-81, which had a more efficient supercharger as well as a newer propeller, putting out 1,330 horsepower and a top speed of 409 miles per hour at 10,000 feet. With a top ceiling of 34,000 feet, the Spitfire and the ME-109 could and did still fight at altitudes higher than the P-51A was able to reach. With the more efficient engine and the ability to carry 150-gallon drop tanks, the ferry range of the Mustang reached a staggering 2,700 miles. The armament was similar to the A-36, except for the deletion of the nose-mounted guns, meaning it only had 4 wing-mounted machine guns. The aircraft was 750 pounds lighter, thanks to the deletion of these guns and the lack of dive brakes. The wing also had the ability to carry bazooka-style rocket launchers mounted under the wing outboard of the hardpoints. Provisions were still made for the fitting of the 2 cameras, of which 35 were so fitted, these being called the F6B. The first flight of the P-51 the first flight of the P-51A took place on February 3rd, 1943, and deliveries began in March. The bulk of these aircraft were again sent to the North African and China-Burma theaters, joining, and in some cases replacing, the A-36s in the reconnaissance and ground attack role. In September of 1943, the now famous Flying Tigers, the 23rd Fighter Group, replaced their war-weary P-40s with brand new P-51As, and it was this unit that first successfully used the P-51 in the bomber escort role that would later make the aircraft famous. On November 25th of 1943, 8 P-51s and 8 P-38s took off and escorted a force of B-25s attacking an enemy airfield in Formosa. This was also the first time that P-51 would use drop tanks in combat. So what are some identifying features of the P-51A? As similar to earlier Allison engine aircraft, it has a long carburetor intake. Importantly, it only has 4 wing guns. So it's got 4 wing machine guns, no nose guns. So as you can see for these first few models of the Allison engine Mustangs, really you're looking at the armament layout to figure out what version it is. It also has underwing hardpoints, which were just slightly farther outboard than you would have found on the A-36. Importantly, no dive brakes, which differentiates it from the A-36, and it has the ability to carry the bazooka-style launchers. So this was the last of the Allison engine models to be produced, and when the last one rolled off the line, over 1,570 Allison engine-powered Mustangs were built, with 764 of those going to the RAF, which was just under half of the total production run.
So the next step in the development of the P-51 was easily the most pivotal in the entire history of the P-51, and I dare say probably the most drastic of any fighter aircraft in World War II, and that was the fitting of the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine to the main design of the P-51, which resulted in the P-51B. Now, this idea actually came independently, as far as I can tell, on both sides of the Atlantic. Both Rolls-Royce in England and North American Aviation in the United States, in Inglewood, California, both sort of realized around the same time that the Merlin engine would be a good fit when it came to the P-51. And the Rolls-Royce team in England was actually the first one to get an engine fitted. So to start off, we're going to be talking about Rolls-Royce and their attempt to mate a Merlin with the P-51 airframe.
So in April of 1942, a Rolls-Royce test pilot by the name of Ronnie Barker realized that the Mustang design was far superior than anything else yet flying, and was only held back by its lack of performance at high altitude. At the time, the only engine available that would provide the necessary power was the Merlin 65. Rolls-Royce engineers started to crunch the numbers and came to the realization that with the Merlin, the Mustang would be able to reach a staggering speed of 441 miles per hour at 25,000 feet, an increase of almost 90 miles per hour at altitude, and almost doubling the combat altitude of the aircraft. A request to install a Merlin in a P-51 for testing was sent to the Air Ministry in mid-1942, and 4 Mustang Is were set aside for the modifications. The approval, however, was never received. The Air Ministry believed that setting aside valuable Merlin engines for testing at this stage of the war was the wrong course of action. Their feeling was, quote, "Why waste time on an untried American-built aircraft?" We can definitely see the world-renowned British sentiment revealing itself here. A second try at permission was tried, this time coming about it from the angle of possibly building an aircraft that could take on, at the time, the far superior Focke-Wulf 190. The bait was taken, and the Merlins were delivered for installation. Now, the Merlin was an amazing engine derived from the Rolls-Royce R racing engine used to win the Schneider Trophy in 1929. It had a 2-stage, 2-speed supercharger as opposed to the single-stage, single-speed unit on the Allison. This increase in compression on the Merlin, coupled with the Stromberg carburetor which injected the fuel before the supercharger, meant it had to have an intercooler in order to reduce the chances of detonation. When Rolls-Royce first installed the engine, the intercooler radiator was installed under the engine, similar to a Lancaster or a P-40 design. This was like hanging a barn door from a Lamborghini. As you can see here, the aircraft does not have the clean lines that we would expect of a P-51. So here is where the intercooler was located, and despite this, the performance was outstanding. A few other modifications that were made included deleting the upper carburetor intake, as the Merlin had an updraft system as opposed to the downdraft system on the Allison. The engine was also slightly larger and required a larger cooling tank. The engine thrust line was raised 3.5 inches and a completely new engine mount was designed. The aircraft had a specially designed 11-foot 4-inch propeller installed to harness this increase in horsepower. The first flight of the Mustang X took place on October 13th of 1942, and the only fault that was found was a tendency to snap roll when power was added too quickly. Rolls-Royce engineers never accounted for the increase in horsepower of the Merlin and failed to provide adequate fin area. An increase in stabilizer offset, as well as a dorsal fillet, was added to the first aircraft, while the following aircraft had a full 3 square feet added to the fin area. 5 aircraft were modified in total, and a top speed of up to 435 miles per hour at an altitude of 25,000 feet were attained, and an absolute ceiling of over 40,000 feet was reached. Most pilots stated that the lack of directional stability and adequate rudder control detract seriously from its fighting capabilities. By the 6th test flight, it had been discovered that the intercooler was not needed, and the undernose intake was cut down, significantly increasing the airframe performance. Work on the Mustang X quickly came to an end, as there was another version waiting to take center stage.
So just as work on the Mustang X began at the Rolls-Royce factory in England, Rolls-Royce engineers had told North American Aviation about their plan to fit a Merlin. The North American Aviation engineers had already talked about the possibility of mounting a Merlin engine to the airframe, and when word that the English were attempting this, they then decided to go ahead with their own project and see if they could beat the British into the air with a Merlin-engined P-51.
So whereas Rolls-Royce effectively just grafted a Merlin onto the P-51 airframe, North American Aviation went about redesigning the P-51 in order to accommodate the Packard V1650 Merlin, which was a license-built copy of the Rolls-Royce Merlin. So just like the Mustang X, the engine mounts were beefed up, the engine thrust line was raised 3 inches, and the upper carburetor intake was deleted. Unlike the Rolls-Royce design, the North American Aviation engineers had the intercooler radiator located in the belly scoop with the coolant radiator, but still had a deep intake below the engine just after the propeller to feed the carburetor intake. The propeller, similar to the Mustang X, would be a 4-bladed, 11-foot, 2-inch Hamilton standard type that had a rubber cuff installed near the root to increase its performance. Here's a picture showing the difference in the cowling area, and here is a picture of a cuffed propeller. It is very hard to find good pictures of cuffed props, as most airworthy examples today fly with an uncuffed propeller, so this is a picture of parts for a model. So the cuff was intended to increase the angle of attack of the blade, thus increasing the thrust at the root, where the blade speed would be slower. This aided in airflow through the carburetor intake, as well as the radiator and the oil cooler. With the Merlin-powered Mustang, the exhaust could either be left exposed or have an aluminum shroud installed to minimize drag. The use of shrouds on the exhaust is hit or miss, as some pilots and ground crews preferred to remove them for ease of maintenance and due to lack of spares at forward operating bases. Other than the cowling and some internal systems changes, the basic design at this point had been changed little from the P-51A design, retaining the wing and armament from earlier designs with 1,250 total rounds of ammunition carried. The modification of the airframe took a staggering 223,000 hours to complete, compared to the 78,000 hours it took to come up with the original NA-73 design. The XP-51B prototype was completed in late October, a few weeks after the Rolls-Royce design, and ground testing commenced immediately. During the ground runs, it was discovered that the engine temps slowly creeped up, but after a thorough flushing, it was deemed satisfactory. On November 30th, 1942, Bob Chilton took the XP-51B up for its first flight. 45 minutes later, he landed with an overheating engine that was leaking coolant and blowing steam. It was later found that the metal of the radiator was incompatible with the glycol and was causing the glycol to gum up and clog the system. A new, slightly larger radiator was needed, and this required a slight deepening of the radiator housing. The initial modification was found to cause excessive noise and vibration, so a complete redesign was needed. The new design deepened the housing further and moved the intake farther down out of the boundary layer of the lower wing. On top of solving the noise and vibration, it also had the benefit of increasing the airflow through the radiator itself. The final benefit from the redesign of the radiator intake was the unintended boost given to the aircraft from the ramjet effect created by the radiator housing and rear door. As stated before, while this did not add a significant amount of overall thrust, it is at least cancelled out by the drag and post of the airframe from the radiator itself. This new design not only changed the shape of the housing, but there were significant internal changes. Instead of the radiator and the oil cooler being mounted together, the radiator was moved up and aft, and the oil cooler was installed forward and lower down, with its own intake and exhaust doors. Here's the picture we saw earlier that shows the radiator and the oil cooler locations. This allowed the coolant temperatures and oil temperatures to be managed independently. With the amazing numbers that both Rolls-Royce and North American Aviation had come up with regards to the Merlin-powered P-51, the United States Army Air Force purchased 400 on the 26th of August 1943, a full 6 weeks before the Mustang X flew, and almost 12 weeks before the XP-51 did. This was quickly followed by an order of 1,000 by the RAF. With production of Allison engine P-51 still going strong, as well as the AT-6 and the B-25, space was in short supply at North American Aviation's Inglewood, California plant, and plans were made to start production at their Dallas factory, which was being used to license build the B-24. P-51s built at the Inglewood plant were called P-51Bs, and the ones built at the Dallas plant becoming P-51Cs, although both were almost identical in every way. The first flight of a production B was May 5th, 1943, and the C followed on August 5th of 1943. Production aircraft differed only slightly from the prototype B, the major changes being the reduction of depth in the undernose intake and the fitting of modified P-51A hardpoints on the wings capable of holding up to 1,000 pounds of fuel or ordnance. The first aircraft reached England by ship in September of 1943, and they flew there for the first time in November. On December 1st, the P-51B was flown into combat for the first time and was used on an escort mission for the first time on December 5th. On December 13th, P-51Bs took part in an escort mission to Kiel, the farthest fighter mission to date in the war of just over 1,000 miles round trip. This mission also included the first kill for the P-51B, and while the escort fighter had arrived, it wasn't perfect. Many pilots complained of a number of deficiencies with the airframe, but there were two that were most common: jamming guns and poor visibility. The gun issue was due to the way the guns were mounted. Due to the limited space in the wing, as mentioned before, the guns were mounted on a slight outboard angle with the ammo chutes curving up and then down into the breeches, as we can see in this picture, causing the system to foul under high G maneuvers. This was not rectified until the D model arrived. The visibility issue due to the canopy framing, as we have seen before, and was solved using a solution developed by an Englishman, Robert Malcolm. He designed and manufactured a blown plexiglass hood, similar to the early Spitfire models, that could be retrofitted to the P-51. This replaced the swinging clamshell style with the extensive framing, with a single piece style that was slid rearward when opened. This has not only improved the view, important when in a dogfight, but increased the ease of egress in the event of a crash. The old style could not be opened in flight, and if the aircraft rolled over, it would be hard to get a pilot out. The Malcolm hood could be opened in flight, and a pilot could therefore be extricated with ease. Adopted extensively by the RAF, it became so popular that many U.S. Army Air Force units installed them on their aircraft as well. There are a number of other iconic P-51 traits that were first introduced on the B model. The first and most important was the drop tank. The use of drop tanks pre-war was almost non-existent. There was minor use in the Spanish Civil War by the Germans, and it was during the Battle of Britain that their use became widespread with the Germans. It wasn't until 1942 that the RAF started using them when they ferried Spitfires to Malta. In early 1941, work quietly began in the U.S. Army Air Force to get a drop tank designed for the P-38, and when the P-51B rolled around, the only tank available was the 75-gallon aluminum model. Many leaders in the United States Army Air Force, who were mostly members of the bomber mafia, were able to veto the use of these in combat, not only due to their belief of the useless escort fighter, but by pointing out that as a strategic material, dropping these empty tanks over Germany was effectively helping the enemy. This led to the development of the 108-gallon infused paper tank. When dropped, they would be destroyed and would be of no use to the enemy. So here you can see drawings of the two tanks with the 75-gallon and the 108-gallon. The fitting of these tanks more than doubled the total fuel capacity of the early aircraft, and although the handling characteristics of the aircraft were negatively affected by the tanks, their use was widespread. These tanks would be dropped when entering combat so as to decrease weight and drag and increase its performance, and as such, they would have to be used first so as to waste as little fuel as possible. The only problem was a negative reaction between the glue and the fuel, limiting fuel storage time to 8 hours in the tank. The final addition of the P-51B, partway through the production run, was the installation of an 85-gallon fuel tank located behind the pilot just above the radiator. So this increased the internal fuel by 50%, and when used in conjunction with drop tanks, gave the aircraft unbeatable range. Some of the early production P-51Bs had the fuselage tank retrofitted before delivery. So this tank did not come without problems. So when fueled, the tank caused serious lateral control issues, and diligent fuel management by the pilot was necessary to ensure that the drop tanks were as empty as possible and the fuselage tank was low enough to allow combat when contact with the enemy was made. There are several block numbers in the production run of the P-51B and P-51C, and each one signifies a change in design or a new purchase contract. I will briefly go over the significant block numbers and the equipment installed and changed, although not all changes are detailed. So P-51Bs had an NA suffix, while the P-51C had an NT suffix, denoting the factory they were built in, Inglewood and Dallas respectively. These would allow replacement parts to be traced back to their original location. So first, let's go over the P-51B. So it started off the P-51B-1 NA, which is the initial block with the V1650-3 engine, no fuselage tank, and 399 were built. Next was the P-51B-5 NA, and it had the V1650-3 engine installed. The fuselage tank was now installed. It had minor radio changes, and there were also some structural and minor component changes. Next, we had the P-51B-10 NA. It also has the V1650-3 engine, the fuselage tank. At this point, there were some more radio, structural, and component changes, and at this point, the olive drab painting was discontinued at the factory to save weight and limit drag. Now, there were also some units that would still paint camouflage in the field, but at this point, aircraft began to be delivered strictly in an unpainted manner. 398 of these were built. So the last version was the P-51B-15 NA. This then moved on to the V1650-7 engine, which gave it an extra 50 horsepower at takeoff. It still included the fuselage tank and again had some minor radio changes. So 390 of these were built. So now moving on to the P-51C. The P-51C-1 NT started off with the V1650-3 engine. It had no fuselage tank, but already due to the P-51C's production run beginning later than the B, the olive drab paint was discontinued from the get-go to save weight and limit drag, and 350 of these were built. So the P-51C-5 NT, it had the V1650-7 engine fitted, fuselage tank was installed, some more radio and structural component changes also happened, 450 of these were built. Next we have the P-51C-10 NT, so this still has the V1650-7 engine, a fuselage tank was installed, there were more radio structural and component changes, some minor changes. In this case, the dorsal fillet was added at the factory, and we'll go over in a little bit in the next model what this dorsal fillet was. And then 823 of these were built. The final version from the Dallas factory was the P-51C-11 NT, and it had the V1650-7 still fitted, the fuselage tank was installed, and these particular aircraft were optimized for the Pacific Theater. Now, unfortunately, I could not find what these optimizations were, just that they were optimized for the Pacific Theater, and 127 of these were built. Now, out of the total production run of P-51Bs and P-51Cs, 91 aircraft, 71 Bs and 20 Cs, were fitted with oblique cameras just ahead of the tail wheel and became known as the F-6B and F-6C respectively. In all cases, the guns were retained to provide a combat capability. Another technological feature that was added to some aircraft was the AN APS-13 tail warning radar. This would alert the pilots when there was a radar painting the aircraft from the rear. As it could not distinguish between friend or foe, most pilots removed it and relied on the rear view mirrors as the warning bell was distracting during aerial combat. So what are some of the identifying features of the P-51B and P-51C? First and foremost, the forward cowling is completely changed, and it has no upper intake, and it does have a lower nose intake. So it still has the razorback fuselage. Some models would have had the Malcolm hood installed, and then it has the deeper lower radiator intake, and it has 4 wing-mounted machine guns. So in total, there are 1,988 P-51Bs built in Inglewood and 1,750 P-51Cs built in Dallas, with 276 B and 626 of the C models going to the RAF, where they were designated the Mustang III. They were also flown by the South African Air Force, the Chinese Air Force, and the Soviet Union. The final P-51B was retired from the United States Army Air Force in 1949, having been redesignated the F-51B in 1947.
So with the P-51Bs and Cs now entering combat in Europe, North American Aviation started to collect pilot reports and combat data from the war zone in order to ensure that the next production version of the P-51 would correct many of the errors and mistakes and problems that existed in the existing designs. Two common issues basically kept coming up with the airframe. One, lack of firepower due to only having 4 50 cal machine guns, as well as the tendency that they had to jam, which I mentioned there before because of the angle of the guns in the wing, and even with the Malcolm hood, the lack of visibility out of the cockpit. There's still a lot of framing, and that razorback behind the pilot limited his rearward visibility. And up until now, most of the updates on the P-51 have been ad hoc updates that have been scabbed on to the existing design in order to improve the design. At this point, North American Aviation decided to correct many of the problems that the aircraft had and start with a clean sheet design and bring these improvements and updates to the drawing board right from the get-go. And the aircraft that they ended up with was the P-51D.
So the 10th production P-51B, aircraft 4312102, was pulled off the production line and used as a prototype for the P-51D. With the many minor and only one major change to the airframe, not much of the P-51D looked the same as the P-51B. Only the empennage and the V1650-7 engine was carried over and used for the entire production run of the D. And the one thing I do want to point out is a lot of people don't realize that the initial XP51Ds were just modified Bs. You see pictures of the cut-down rear fuselage with the B-style wing. You also see B models with a D wing. There was a lot of variation going on in here as the company tried to figure out what was the best option to fix some of these problems. So the armament seemed to be the easiest of the problems to solve. Just add a third 50 caliber machine gun to each wing. Problems arose, however, with the lack of space due to the thinness of the B wing, and it was decided to redesign the wing to allow the guns to sit vertically. This setup would provide the space needed for the guns, and it would also solve the problems of the guns jamming while in combat. The new wing was slightly deeper to provide this room, and this led to a slightly lower top speed than the B model. The guns were, however, staggered front to back slightly to simplify the ammo chute layout. There were a few other minor changes made to the wings on the D model. The wing spars were strengthened, so the hardpoints can now carry 1,000-pound bombs or the larger 165-gallon drop tanks that were in service. And you can see the larger tanks being used in this picture. Their use was not as common as the 75-gallon unit, and pictures are harder to find, but they are out there if you look hard. The landing gear up locks were modified so as to simplify the retraction sequence, and the landing light was removed from the wing leading edge and replaced with a retractable type that came out of the wheel well bay when the gear was lowered. There was also a kink added to the leading edge of the root in order to lengthen cord and lighten the wing loading, and the navigation lights were moved to the wingtips instead of separate lights above and below the wings present on the previous models. You can see some of the differences between the wings in these pictures here. The improving of the pilot's visibility was a problem that would require much more work to solve. With the advances in plastic technology that came about thanks primarily to the nose glazing of the bombers of the day, think of the B-17, the B-26, and the A-26, it was decided to fit a blown, teardrop-shaped canopy onto the aircraft. This meant that the rear fuselage would have to be redesigned with the high back cut down to the same height as the engine cowling. The canopy was then designed to fit around this contour on a centrally mounted track, and a new forward windscreen was made into this canopy, as seen here. This not only allowed the full 360-degree visibility, but also increased the comfort for taller pilots in the already cramped cockpit. After wind tunnel tests proving the basic design was sound, the first D model was flown for the first time on November 17, 1943, about a month before the first B even entered combat. Like the B model, early P-51Ds did not have the fuselage tank installed, and this was added to later blocks as they rolled down the production line. The known stability issues with this tank, added with the cut-down rear fuselage, meant the D was even more directionally unstable than the B, and it was decided to add a small fin fillet in front of the tail. This fillet greatly added to the stability of the airframe, and kits were produced and sent out to combat units to be added onto aircraft already in service. Some units, who were still flying the B model, added these fillets to the aircraft, offsetting the instability due to the fuselage tank. And as we saw in the C production block breakdown, the fillets were added to the final production run at the factory. A zero-length rocket launchers for 5-inch rockets were added partway through production and were similar to what was installed on the F4U Corsair. So here you can see the rocket launchers on a post-war Air National Guard P-51D. As before, these aircraft were built in both the Inglewood and the Dallas plants, but both aircraft kept the D suffix. The P-51E designation was initially set aside for Dallas-built aircraft, but was later abandoned. The only difference being the NA suffix for Inglewood and the NT suffix for Dallas being used in the block numbers. These block numbers were used to denote significant changes or new orders throughout the production run of the aircraft, the same as in the B and the C model. So let's take the time and we'll go through some of the P-51D block numbers, and you can see the differences that were included. So we'll start off with the Inglewood built aircraft, and we're going to start off with the P-51D-1NA, and 4 of these aircraft were built, but they were a B-style canopy with a D model wing, and I was able to find some pictures of those. I'll throw one up here quickly so you can see what it looks like. Only 4 were ever built. Second up, we have the P-51D-5NA. So this was the initial D model built, and the only differences between this and the prototype really were the supercharger aneroid switch, which was when pressure switch that told the supercharger when to kick on and off. It was moved from the firewall farther into the cowling. 800 of these were built. Next up is the P51D-10NA. Some more minor changes in this one. So the elevator bob weight was added to reduce stick force. So the bob weight was just a small lead weight forward of the hinge line on the elevator. So the dorsal fin was added. Reverse boost tabs were added, and these were used to increase rudder resistance at high speed. The mechanical oil temperature gauge was replaced with an electrical unit, and the 2-speed booster pump switch was replaced with a single low-speed switch. So 800 of these were built. The P51D-15NA standardized landing gear warning lights. It replaced the direct reading fuel pressure gauge with a pressure transmitter, 900 built. The P51D-20NA, so this is when the zero-length 5-inch rocket launchers were installed under the wings. And the provision for bazooka-style rocket launchers was also added. The electric primer pump was replaced to the manual. And the K-14 computing gun sight was added. And 1,600 of this model was built. So next was the P51D-25NA. So in this one, the fabric-covered elevator was replaced with a metal-covered one, and there was a slight change to the angle of incidence of the tail. So 1,600 of these were built. So the P51D-30NA basically was similar to the -25NA, but they were just purchased in a later batch number later in the war. 800 of those were built. Now, similar to what you saw with the Bs and the Cs, the Dallas-built Mark Ds, they don't quite line up with the Inglewood block number since the production runs began at different time, and so some modifications were added at different times in the production run. So you might see some minor changes here. So Dallas started off with the P51D-5NT, and again, this was the initial D model with a fin fillet. It had the fuselage tank, and the elevator bob weight was added to reduce stick force. 200 of these were built. P51D-20NT. This is when the zero-length 5-inch rocket launchers were installed under the wing and provisions for the bazooka-style rocket launchers were added. The fabric cover elevator was replaced with the metal-covered one, and there was a change to the angle of the incident of the tail, and 400 were built. So the P51D-25NT. So this replaced the direct reading fuel pressure gauge with a pressure transmitter, and the electric primer pump replaced with the manual one. 600 were built. And then the P51D-30NT, again, just like with the NA versions, this was similar to the 25NT, but purchased through a late order. 400 were built. Now, the other thing we need to look at are some of the many field modifications that were performed on the P51D, and we'll go over a couple of highlights of these here. So first of all, there was modifications allowing a P51D to carry the 10-inch Tiny Tim rocket, which is a massive rocket. You'll see a picture of it here. It is just insanely large when it's mounted on the P51. There was also setups for multiple bomb racks. So the one bomb shackle was designed to carry multiple bombs. And here's actually a picture I found of a triple bomb setup that was rigged on the field. And I've even seen, I've read, I should say, of modifications to have twin drop tanks. But I haven't been able to find any pictorial reference of this, but there is anecdotal written evidence of P51s carrying 2 drop tanks on each wing. So that would have been pretty cool. Now, the ones you just saw here were never sanctioned by North American Aviation or the United States Army Air Force. The only field mods that were sanctioned were radio navigation equipment that was fitted to the Pacific-based P51s. Now, this was due to the extreme distances that were flown over the ocean where no landmarks or bearings could be taken. Now, this setup was called the Uncle Dog radio setup and included 2 radio masts behind the cockpit, a radio mast under the cowling, and another aft of the right main gear. So you can see the twin rear and undernose antenna in this picture. It is very hard to find clear shots of this system, and some also had a DF loop just in front of the fin fillet. So there was also 136 of the D models that were fitted with rear fuselage cameras and were called F6Ds. And again, these are kind of hard to find pictures of. There is one flying today, Sierra Suit 2. I've managed to see it at a few air shows. So it is a unique setup. I did get a really good close-up shot of the camera setup so you can see what that looks like. So some of the identifying features of the P-51D are, so look at the Merlin engine, the bubble canopy, 6 machine guns in the wings, cuffed props, although sometimes they were removed in combat, so that is not always an uncuffed prop could still technically be a P-51D if a lot of these other features are met. So it has the leading edge wing kink. One of the more interesting ways to look at it, if you look at the forward cowling vent, the D model had one corner cut off. So it wasn't a perfect square. It had one corner cut off, and that will make sense in a little bit. And there were no fin fillets on the early models. That's an easy way to tell the early model P-51Ds from the later model. Although, as I said, some of them got them added on after, so it isn't always a perfect way of telling it. In total, there were 8,200 D model P-51s built, more than all the other versions combined, with 281 being delivered to the RAF and 100 being shipped to the Royal Australian Air Force for assembly there. Although not quite as fast as the B model, the D became the best fighter at the end of World War II due to its combination of speed, range, and firepower. The last F-51, which is what the P-51 was renamed after the United States Army Air Force, was formed in 1947, wasn't retired from the Air National Guard until the 1950s. Although they were used as frontline fighters by many other nations right up to the 1980s, with the Dominican Republic being the last, retiring them in 1984. Due to the high top speed and long range, the U.S. Air Force recalled many mothballed airframes and put them back into active duty during the Korean War. They were able to use the shorter frontline airfields that the jets weren't able to use, but many pilots were unaccustomed to flying a high torque piston fighter, and many pilots wrecked the aircraft due to pilot error, especially on the takeoff roll. With the large number of accidents and the high combat losses, the Mustang was pulled from combat after only 2 years in Korea. 10 airframes were also modified to the P-51D standard by TEMCO by removing the rear fuselage tank, relocating the radios, and adding full dual controls. Now, you'll see today there's a lot of TF-51s flying. Many of them are modern modifications and not an actual TEMCO TP-51D. So I'm going to go out of sequence a little bit here, and I'm going to talk about the P-51K. So the P-51Ks were identical to the Ds, save for a few minor items. The K models were only ever built in Dallas, although not all Dallas-built machines are K, which makes this a little more difficult to pick out from the vast majority of aircraft. So the main difference between the D and the K was the prop, and in some cases, the canopy. So let's take a quick and detailed look at the K model so you can better understand what was done. So due to the high production rate of many of the U.S. aircraft manufacturers during the war, Hamilton Standard had trouble keeping up with propeller output. Due to this shortfall, it was decided to fit an 11-foot diameter Aero Products propeller to the P-51. This propeller did not have the cuffs and had a slightly different profile than the Hamilton Standard ones normally fitted, widening out towards the center, then narrowing down to a small curved tip. So here, this picture's from scale models, or the parts for scale models, but you can clearly see the difference between the props with the Aero Products on the left and the Hamilton Standards on the right. The blades are made from steel and had a hollow core to keep the weight down, almost 50 pounds lighter than the Hamilton Standard ones. Most crew chiefs and mechanics did not like this propeller, and many suffered from severe vibrations due to being out of balance, with almost 20% being returned to the manufacturer. Another feature of the K is a slightly larger canopy to give more headroom to pilots, but the difference is very subtle. So here you can see the slight difference at the back of the canopies in this drawing, and this canopy is usually referred to as a Dallas-style canopy. Many of the Ks in the field had the Hamilton Standard props installed, and some even had the older V1650-3 engine installed, so without looking at a data plate or a serial number, it can be hard to tell the difference between a D and a K. Most modern warbirds are difficult to identify as many have cuffless Hamilton standard props, and some even have had a Dallas canopy installed to a D model to allow more headroom for second seats to give ride programs. So some of the significant block numbers for the K are the P51K-5NT, equivalent more or less to a P51D-10NT. So it's got a 2-speed booster pump switch replaced with a single low-speed switch. 600 were built. The P51K-10NT replaced the direct reading fuel pressure gauge with a pressure transmitter, replaced fabric-covered elevator with a metal-covered one, and changed the angle of the tail incidence. 600 were built. The P51K-15NT, the electric primer pump replaced with a manual one, the zero-length rocket launchers were installed onto the wings, and 300 of those were built. So some of the distinctive features of this model are, overall, similar to the P51D, a larger bubble canopy, and the uncuffed Aero Products prop. Now, the major one, which I hinted at when I talked about the D model, is the nose vent, and the P51K has a perfectly square nose vent. So I was not able to find a definite reason why there are two different types, but as you can see here, the P51D had the one corner cut, while the P51K is a perfect square. These vents allowed air into the engine cowling area, and the pilot was able to selectively block the chin intake and pull air from the cowling area, which was heated by the engine and was used to minimize the chances of carb icing. So a total of 1,337 K models were built, with 594 going to the RAF as the Mustang IV-A, 87 being shipped to the RAAF, and 163 being converted to the F6K standard, which was basically the same thing as the F6D photo reconnaissance model. So due to the difficulty of visually identifying a K model, many pictures and sources refer to them simply as P51Ds, especially as I said, in combat, most of the K model props were replaced with Hamilton standard props, and when you start getting into combat scenarios with parts being intermingled, the K models very quickly lost their identity, and it's very hard to keep track of what is what once they hit the field. So the final P51D variant we'll go over is the CAC Mustang. So in November of 1944, the Australian government decided to purchase locally built P51s to replace the P40s and boomerangs currently being used as frontline fighters. So 100 P51Ds were shipped in kit form to the Commonwealth Aircraft Corporation, or CAC, to kickstart the production line, with 80 of these being built as the CA-17 Mark XX, with the last 20 being kept for spare parts. In late 1946, another contract was signed for another 170, later reduced to 120, entirely in-house produced P51s. These were designated CA-18 Mark 21, 22, or 23. The 21 was built with either the V1650-3 or -7, while the 23s were built with either the Rolls-Royce Merlin 66 or 70. 26 Mark 21s and 66 Mark 23s were built. The first Mark 21s were modified into the reconnaissance Mark 22, with 2 cameras mounted in the rear fuselage retaining the wing guns. A further 14 purpose-built Mark 22s were completed after the Mark 23s were built. All CAC-built P51s, including the 88Ks, were given the RAAF prefix of A68.
Thank you for watching, guys, and as always, if you are interested in any of the content you see, you can access my website at www.seans-aviation.com. You can see all the latest pictures of aircraft and museums and the build logs of all of my current models and past models on that site. And if you're interested in any of this content, please click the subscribe button here on YouTube to follow more. Thank you very much, and see you guys next time.